Hey, what is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we are going to be taking a look at the Rosson Audio Design RAD-0. Now, for those of you that don't know, Alex Rosson was the former CEO of Audeze and one of the co-founders. But he left Audeze a couple years ago and went and started his own company, which is Rosson Audio Design. And they made a few things before. I think they made like a turntable and some cabinet. It's like some furniture or something weird. But now he is back making planar-magnetic headphones. And this is his first one. This is one of the first edition, which is one of the first 100 of the RAD-0. And this headphone comes in a Pelican-like case, much like an Audeze headphone. So we will go on ahead and pop this thing open. And inside we will see the RAD-0 as well as its cable and a sticker. So I'm going to pull this thing out of here along with the cable, and then we will get the case out of the way. Okay, so this is the RAD-0. Now, this headphone is made of resin, which is like the same stuff that a bowling ball is made out of. And that means that each pair is unique. They all are their own unique colors and patterns. So no two pairs are going to be alike. So this is what this particular one looks like. And if you want one that looks just like this, unfortunately, you have to buy this exact one. And speaking of buying this exact one, this headphone was provided for review today by headphones.com. They've sent me a few other things, and now they have sent me the RAD-0. So big shout out to them. They are an online audio retailer with the 365-day return policy. So if you buy something from them, you have 1 year to decide if you like it or not. So definitely check them out. And once again, big thanks for sending these out for review. Okay, so now let's move on in to specs. And Rosson really doesn't give too many specs about these. The only things really worth noting is they are $2,600. They are planar magnetic open back with an impedance of 29 ohms. No sensitivity given, and weight is somewhere around, I believe, 530-ish grams as far as I know. Okay, so moving on into the build of the RAD-0. It is a very well-built headphone. It feels very solid. So this is all leatherette. Both the headband, the pad, and the ear pads are all leatherette. The ear pads themselves are a hybrid pad with a very, very soft cloth material for this part of the pad. Metal yokes with this is plastic, but this is metal, and like I said, metal yokes, metal grill with the spiral with the Rosson Audio Design logo in there. And then 3.5mm connectors, which we're going to talk about in a second because these are actually somewhat interesting. And as I mentioned before, these are once again resin, and you can see how it looks in the light, and it does change a lot depending on the lighting and the angle and how it looks. So overall, these feel like a really solid headphone. Definitely feel like a $2,600 headphone should. And moving on into the comfort. So the RAD-0 apparently has already gone a revision which changes its headband, which apparently removes about 100 grams from the weight. So I think the old ones were probably over 600. Mine does have the new headband, apparently, is what headphones.com told me. So the thing to note about this is when I originally heard these at CanJam New York this year, they were very, very clampy. Like, they had so much clamp force, and these are still pretty clampy, but I don't think it's quite as clampy as the original headband was, but I might be wrong on that. But from memory, I don't think it's as clampy. But other comfort things. So the big problem with the comfort on the RAD-0 is this headband pad. And the problem is these are heavy, and it puts all that weight on such a small area, because at least on my head, my head doesn't even make contact with this entire pad. Like, it probably stops about like there on both sides. So it's a lot of weight to put on a very small section of your head. So this hurts my head in like 10 minutes or less. I get a hot spot really quickly, and it does become uncomfortable, which is a shame because the ear pads are quite good. They have about the same depth as an Audeze pad. This dimension is not as thick, and I think the cups are a little bit smaller than an Audeze cup because this pad looks a little smaller than an Audeze pad, but they are very soft. This is a softer, more pliable foam than an Audeze pad, and I really like how soft this fabric is. So ear pads are good. I really like the ear pads, but the headband pad is not good. This is much like an Audeze EL8 headband pad. And Rosson does need to go to a suspension strap. Take something from your former company with this headband. This is a much better headband style here that is on the HE6. This is the LCD4 headband. So yeah, comfort for me is not good, but if you don't have a problem with hot spots in your head, then you might like this, but this design, in my opinion, is not good. Okay, so now moving on into the cable segment here. So when I first got these, I looked at the stock cable and I said, this is a very generic stock headphone cable that you would buy on like Alibaba or something in bulk. Kind of stiff, like fabric covered or whatever. Very generic looking 3.5 millimeters. So I said, all right, no problem. I'll just go plug in my balance cable and all will be good. So I plug in my balance cable and my amp starts shorting out and nothing's playing. So I was really confused as to what was going on. And then I went back to the stock cable and the headphone worked fine. So I took a multimeter and started messing with this cable. And for whatever reason, Rosson decided to wire this headphone in a non-conventional way, which is really stupid. So typically on a 3.5 millimeter headphone cable, what you'll do is you'll wire both the tips of both sides will be your positive, and then I believe it's left right on the source connector. If it'll focus, there we go. Like left positive, right positive. And then the negatives of both you'll take either from the sleeve or the ring on these, and they'll both share the sleeve on the source connection. Now, for whatever reason, what Rosson did was, on the left one he wired it correctly. He took the tip and the sleeve and did positive, negative, and then positive, negative on the source connector. But on the right side, he wired the positive to the ring and the negative to the sleeve. So this headphone is wired asymmetrically on both sides. And why he did that is beyond me. I have no idea. Now, I thought maybe he was like, all right, he's selling upgrade cables for this and he wants a proprietary pinout. So he's like, hey, regular cables don't work for this, so you have to buy my upgrade cable. But he doesn't sell upgrade cables, so I have no idea why he did this and wired it asymmetrically, unless he just bought a bunch of these cables and didn't know they were wired asymmetrically, and then built the headphone around this stock cable. Which, if he did that, shame on him for doing that. You should have just eaten the cost on this and done it correctly, because now anybody who has standard 3.5 millimeter headphone cables, they don't work. You got to buy another one specific to this pinout on the RAD-0, which is just bad. So if you buy one of these, you have to use the stock cable unless you get a custom made cable for this. So you either have to find somebody who makes RAD-0 cables, or when you buy a generic cable, you have to tell them the pinout of this cable, which it's just, why would you do that? All right, and then moving on from the cable into the power segment, this headphone is not the easiest thing in the world to drive, not unreasonably hard. Any somewhat decent amp should push them without too much problem. I mean, they're not like insane, but they're not super easy to drive. So you're not gonna run them on onboard, but your Magni Atom, no problem. So not too hard to drive, but just have an amp of some sort and you'll be all right. All right, moving on into the sound segment of the RAD-0. So coming from Audeze, the RAD-0 does share some of that Audeze heritage in the tuning. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I originally heard this headphone at Can Jam New York, and that was an early prototype. And from my show impressions, I actually really liked it. But after hearing the final release, I have to say that my impressions have waned a bit. So starting off, as usual, the bass is very flat. Maybe I'd say a slight little bit of roll-off, not quite perfectly flat, just the slightest little bit of bass roll-off, but close enough where you would say pretty much flat bass. After that, fairly standard Audeze fare of like rolling off at 1.5K. And this rolls off not as much as an LCD2, but not more than an LCD4. It's somewhat in between. So I'd say you have about 5 to 6 dB of roll off by the time you hit around 3K. So yeah, just that standard Audeze mid canyon, and then right around 7K-ish, the treble starts coming back up. And then on sine sweep, the highest point of the treble peak to me was right around 7.8K. And then after that, it just dropped back off a little bit. So yeah, 7.8K-ish is like the peak of the treble, and then it comes back down a little bit, more in line with the lower mids after like 9-10K-ish. So this is fairly standard for an Audeze tuning, even though it's not an Audeze. So he seems to have kept his tuning consistent from his days at Audeze. Very, very standard looking and sounding Audeze sound signature here on the RAD-0, which is somewhat disappointing. I wish he would have done something where the mids weren't as recessed, just to distinguish himself from Audeze. But it seems that he's still carrying that over from those Audeze days. Now, moving on from that, the soundstage is not as wide as an LCD. It's narrower than an LCD2, but it's not narrow, it's just not as wide as a LCD2. So it's still a good soundstage, but it's not as wide as an Audeze. And then that also, the imaging is pretty good. It's nothing to write home about, but it images well enough. Now, timbre is actually fairly good. I actually think tonally it sounds a little more natural than an LCD2 from memory. I think the timbre is not excessively plasticky and sounds a little more natural than LCD2, like I said, from my memory. But the problem with this headphone is the dynamics. This headphone is suffering from the Mr. Speakers ism, where it's over dampened and it makes the bass sound a bit limp. Now, it's not as bad as a Mr. Speakers headphone. It's not that compressed, but it's still somewhat compressed and lacking in dynamics. So this headphone, I think a lot of people won't notice as much, even if you didn't notice Mr. Speakers, because the bass is elevated above the mids so much that the bass is just naturally louder. So it sounds like it has bass and has impact. But when you listen to songs and test tracks that test, bass dynamics and rumble, it's really lacking. Like 2049 is just like missing almost the entire bass note. And that goes the same with pretty much all my other bass tests. It just lacks the rumble and the slam and the dynamics of a good planar. This has, I would say, about $500 in planar dynamics. So it is definitely somewhat compressed, somewhere around, I would say, one of the mid-level hi-fi men offerings in terms of dynamics. So that is quite disappointing. I don't remember that from Can Jam, so I don't know if anything's changed with the tuning, or if it's just show impressions, which it could be. But that is their biggest problem, is they just are lacking in dynamics, unfortunately. Now, moving on to detail. Treble detail actually is pretty good. The strings on these sound fairly detailed with good speed, but the mid-range is really hazy. It's really strange. Usually you don't have super hazy mids, but decent treble detail. I mean, I've heard of few other headphones, but not super common. But this thing, the treble sounds pretty good, but the mids just have all this haze and lack of detail and some grain. And it's weird, but the strings sound pretty decent, and the treble and all the high notes. And then bass resolution is, it's acceptable, I guess, but like I said, lacking in dynamics and not the best. So moving on into the comparison segment here. So this at $2,600 is more than an LCD 3. But it sits, I guess, between LCD 3 and MX4. The LCD MX4 is not very good, and I think Audeze knows it, because last year they sold it brand new for half price for like 2 months, and I expect them to do it again to get rid of stock. The LCD 24 apparently isn't very good. I haven't heard it, but I've seen some measurements and impressions of it. It doesn't look that good. So it sits, I guess, between the LCD 3 and LCD 4 in terms of pricing. I think most people are probably going to compare it to the 3 more than the 4, because it's closer to the 3 price than the 4 price. The RAD-0 to me, I would say, sounds like an LCD 3 or an LCD X with hazy mids but worse dynamics. It's like if you took an LCD 3 and then made the mids hazy and then gave it the dynamics of like a Sundara. It's a strange offering. It's way less dynamic than like the HE6 here when amped properly, or way less dynamic than the LCD 4. LCD 4 just kills this thing. But it sounds less dynamic than the modern LCD 2 to me, but it has better treble resolution than the LCD 2, but worse soundstage. It's less detailed than HD 800. I would say it's probably less detailed than Clear. Aria probably close to the treble, but the Aria's mids are not this hazy. See, that's the thing, is if it kept the same treble resolution in the mid-range as it did with the if it kept the same resolution in the treble as it did with the mid-range, it would not be too bad, but the haziness in the mids just kind of makes it where it's just like loses to a lot of stuff. So this to me would almost be like what I would expect an LCD 1 to be if they made an LCD 1 like actually an LCD shape and style. Like, I feel like it would have this level of dynamics. This would be like the $500 Audeze LCD in terms of dynamics, although the resolution in this is better than $500, at least in the treble. So it's hard to really know what to compare to, because it lacks the dynamics and the mid-range detail of an LCD 3, but it has the treble detail of like an LCD 3 or LCD X, but it's not the treble resolution of an LCD 4, which a used LCD 4 is about this price. So, I mean, where does it really sit? It's hard to say. So, in conclusion, the RAD-0 is an interesting headphone. I really like the build, and I really like the looks. It's truly a work of art, but it has too many compromises in the sound, unfortunately, and a dumb cable. But it just doesn't distinguish itself from a Audeze headphone enough in my book. It only really distinguishes itself in look, but the comfort's lacking, the dynamics are lacking, hazy mid-range, and I think I would just rather buy a used LCD 4 or a new LCD 3 over this thing personally. But Rosson, keep up the work. I definitely think this has room for improvement, and you definitely do have a shot here. This seems like it has the potential. It's just being held back by a couple things. Change the headband and work on maybe removing some of the dampening to get some of those dynamics back. And I think maybe the RAD-1, this is 0, so maybe the next one, RAD-1, could be a legitimate contender. Like this, it seems salvageable. Just a few little fixes, and I think this thing would be a good headphone, and or a better headphone. It's not a horrible headphone. And you see, I think a lot of people are going to end up liking this because it sounds pretty good overall. I don't think it's like a horrible sounding headphone, but for its price point, I just find it lacking. I could see maybe paying $1,000 for it, but 26, no. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of the RAD-0. Once again, thanks to headphones.com for sending these out for review. Links of where to buy one version of these in the description below, as well as the ears graph, my Twitter, and my contact email, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.